Sabah al-khair. In this video I want to talk with you about Arabic verbs whose first root letter, in their judr is either a waw or a ya. In Arabic we would call a verb like this الفعل المثال. Sometimes in English we refer to them as assimilated verbs for reasons that you're going to see very soon. They conjugate slightly differently sometimes, and in this video what I want to do is bring your attention to some of the more important exceptions and idiosyncrasies in terms of how they work. Of those two letters, waw tends to be the more common of the two. We have a lot more verbs in Arabic whose judhur start with waw than start with ya, and that's where the majority of this video's focus will be, but we will talk a little bit about verbs whose judhur begin with ya at the end as well. So for most verb patterns, and I'm assuming that you're familiar with Arabic verb patterns here, these awzan, for most awzan, a verb isn't going to act any differently than a regular verb. They're going to conjugate exactly the same. We're not going to worry about any shifting or changing or disappearing letters. A quick couple of examples. Two related verbs, both of which mean more or less to communicate. Wasala and tawasala. The judr is waw, sad, lam in both of these cases, and we've put them into the verb patterns and they work just like regular verbs. If we want to add a prefix for, say, huwa, yuwasil, or yatawasil, they're going to work exactly the same. Or if we wanted to add a conjugation suffix at the end, no difference, none whatsoever. There are three main verb patterns where we're going to have to watch for something a little different. The first of them is form 1. Form 1, verbs like this, with waw as the first root letter, are going to work normally in the past tense, but in the present tense we're going to drop that waw and replace it with the suffix or the prefix-suffix combo. So, wajada, for example, is a verb meaning to find in Arabic, but if we wanted to say in the present tense, he finds, we would need to remove that waw and just replace it with the huwa conjugation. So we would wind up with yajid. Kasra just happens to be the vowel there. Or another verb, waqa'a, which can mean stand in a spot or fall, depending on the context. If we wanted to say, she stands, she is standing, we would say taqa. So in both cases, we've removed the waw entirely from the conjugation. That is not the case with passive verbs. So if we wanted to make wajada passive, that's actually a very common way of saying there is or there are. It's equivalent to huneka, which is a word you might know. But we could also say, I'll put it here, yujad. So we retain that passive vowel combination, the dhamma and the fatha, and we keep the waw in a case like that. Or there's a good example from the Quran actually. In Surah Al-Ikhlas, there is part of an ayah that reads in part Lam yalid wa lam yulad. Walada is a verb meaning to give birth, and the subject of these verbs is God, Allah. So lam yalid, he does not give birth. Wa lam yulad, he has not been begotten. So from our verb, we've removed the waw when we're talking about the active voice, and we retain the waw when we're talking about the passive voice. In form 4, things are pretty close to normal, with one important exception, and that's creating the masdar. We're going to retain the waw in our form pattern, as in the case of awdaha, which means to clarify, or awfada, which means to delegate or to send. And in the present tense, yudah, afwan, yudih, and yufid. We keep that waw, we have our normal vowels, but because of the masdar pattern, which is if'al, we have a kasra on this first letter. And the strength of the kasra means that our waw needs to match that kasra, so it actually turns into a ya. So the masdar of awdaha would be idah. And the masdar of afwada would be ifad. It helps to remember that formal Arabic can't tolerate the vowel combination u because it sounds gross. So if we tried to retain the waw here, we would have iudah or iufad, which are not permissible in Arabic. It's just not something we can do. For the same reason, in Form 8, something slightly different happens. Form 8 pattern is ifta'ala. So our waw would be taking the place of that fa. But once again, if we did that, we would have the same problem because of the way these verbs are structured. We would wind up with an ew sound. So we have a different solution, which is the waw assimilates and cohabitates with the ta that's part of the pattern. So ittasala, which is a verb meaning to be in contact with, or sometimes to telephone someone, attasal bishakhs. There is a waw that is part of the root, but it's not represented here as a waw. Instead, it is represented, sort of, under this shadda. It's as though the waw has temporarily become a ta in order to comply with the rules of Arabic. Same thing with another verb, ittasafa, which sort of means to be characterized by, from wasf, which means a description. That is our judr. We do have a waw, but the waw is hiding. The waw is sort of latent in this particular structure. So, as you're listening and reading, it's good to remember that if you encounter a new verb in the present tense whose root only seems to have 2 letters, or if you encounter a verb that only seems to have 2 letters of a root, but you do have that double ta, there's a very good chance that what you're actually dealing with is a fa'al mithal with a waw that has temporarily disappeared just because of the rules of Arabic. So verbs whose roots begin with ya are much less common, but I do want to talk about them a little bit just in case someone tries to claim that they don't exist. The good news is the ya isn't going to change or morph or disappear in the same way that waw does ordinarily. So just a couple of examples, the verb yabisa or yabusa, I've heard both variations, which means to go dry or be dry. We might refer to bread that way, stale bread, khubz yabis, is a verb where in the present tense we're actually going to have 2 yas side by side. Yaibas. Yay! It sounds kind of happy. And yaisa, which means to give up or maybe to despair sometimes. Same thing. If we're saying he is giving up, we would say yai'as. The seat of the hamza shifts there. That's another discussion for another time. That's an irregularity of that verb for different reasons. But we're retaining that ya in the root. It stays there. We don't have any problems. And that is al-fa'al al-mithal in Arabic.